I can't bring you a reflection on it. I can't do justice that story of those that were at the heart of it. And I thought, actually, what we should do is we should speak to somebody who was on the periphery of that story, who was caught up in it in a different way, in the knock-on effect. Do you see what I'm saying? And this woman and her story is that, and it is incredible. Beverley Bass was flying one of the 38 planes that were forced to land in Newfoundland in Canada that afternoon. She had to turn around and speak these words to the passengers behind her. She had to digest it. One of the first people in the world, presumably, to digest this news. And her story generally of her life is truly incredible as well. Let's speak to her now. Beverley Bass joins you from America. Hello, Beverley, good morning.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I just want to make one correction.
Yes.
I was the third pilot hired by American Airlines, but I was the first captain for American. So I just needed to make that little correction.
Sure.
But yes, my story was indeed quite different. And, there's a little bit of survivor's guilt about that because while our country was suffering through the worst tragedy in American history, those of us who landed in Gander, Newfoundland on that day, and I was one of the 38 wide bodies that was diverted there, we were treated so beautifully, and it was like we were living in a different world than what America was going through, and we were just treated beautifully. I mean, they took us in their homes. We stayed. Some of the passengers stayed in fire stations, churches, schools. They shut their city down for 5 days while they accommodated us.
Beverley, can we go back to the beginning? Can you talk us through the moment in the cockpit on the way to the United States of America that you got that message 18 years ago today?
Yes, I was flying from Paris to Dallas. I was right over the middle of the North Atlantic, and we have what we call our air-to-air radio frequencies that all of the airliners have to monitor because we are out of range of air traffic control. So when we're over international waters, it gives us a way to communicate with each other. And that day, an airplane that was ahead of us, a little bit farther west, came on and said that one of the World Trade Centers had been hit by an airplane. And like many, we thought it was a small airplane. And about 20 minutes later, they came on that frequency and said that the second tower had been hit, and with that came the word airliner and the word terrorism. And, I guess it was at that moment that we knew things were changing rapidly. Right after that, we heard that New York's airspace was closed. And then the most dreaded information we received was that all of the U.S. airspace was closed. And that meant that every single airplane that was airborne that day over the U.S. and those of us that were proceeding to the U.S. would not be landing there. So for us, it meant a diversion to Canada. And, we assumed it would be one of the big cities like Toronto or Montreal. And when we approached 50 degrees west longitude, which is where we actually come in contact with Gander Air Traffic Control, they ordered us to land in Gander. And so I was number 36 out of 38 to land that day.
And so presumably you were one of the first people as well to receive that information, weren't you, Beverley?
Right. Well, the U.S. airplanes, of course, were getting the information because they had to drain the skies immediately. And we in the international environment were just kind of left on our own. I had no communication with American Airlines, which was okay. I can, fly the airplane. I can land it wherever I need to land it without communicating with them. And recognize we had just lost 2 airplanes. So American Airlines had a lot on their plate at that moment. And the international airplanes just kind of handled themselves, if you will.
And presumably you have to turn and you have to communicate what's happened to hundreds of innocent passengers and change their lives as well through the tannoy system.
Right, and that was the hardest PA I've ever made. And I thought about it for a long time before I said anything. And I called my flight attendants up to make sure that what I was going to say was okay with them because, they're the ones that are going to be back with the passengers. I'm sitting behind a locked cockpit door. So I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Bass. There's been a crisis in the United States. All of the airspace is closed, and we're going to be landing our airplane in Gander, Newfoundland. When we get on the ground, I'll get back to you with information. And that was what I said, and that worked fine. I didn't have any problem with any of my passengers in the back of the plane.
Blimey. Imagine hearing that information as well and being on the plane and unable to kind of figure out what that was. So you're diverted to Gander, as you say, in Canada. You get the call to go and to land there. What happens next?
Well, we actually were overweight for landing, so they vectored me out over the Atlantic so that I could jettison 7,000 pounds of fuel and get down to my landing weight. And then I was on a long final approach to runway 22, and there were 38 wide bodies there that day. I was number 36 out of 38. And when I landed, all I could see were airplanes parked nose to tail on every taxiway in the terminal area, on some of the runways that were unused. I mean, nobody had ever seen that many wide bodies in Gander, Newfoundland in their life. It is an airport that can accommodate a lot of airplanes. It was built during World War II by the U.S. government. And so there had been many airplanes in Gander, but much smaller ones. They never had that many wide bodies. And on an average day, they get about 6 airplanes landing there. And in a 3-hour time frame, we nearly doubled their population. They had a population of 9,400 people, and we were nearly 7,000 passengers and crew, and we stayed for 5 days.
Blimey. And so 5 days in Gander, but also a long time on the plane? Presumably they didn't just let you wander off.
A long time, because, they had to figure out the logistics about how they were going to transport all of the passengers and crew. The school bus drivers were on strike, and they agreed to come off strike to transport us. And we were actually on our airplane for 28 hours. We had flown for 7 hours, and when we touched down at about 10:15 the morning of 9/11, they came on our airplane and they said, "You will not be getting off until tomorrow." And that's what happened. So 21 more hours on the ground, and we got off at 7:30 the next morning. But throughout the evening, they supplied water, Nutri-Grain bars, smoking patches, diapers, formula, all the things that you just don't even think that would be in the belly of the airplanes that the passengers don't have access to.
Yeah. The world in the hour, those 28 hours that you were on the plane was in chaos. America particularly was chaotic, with so much information flying around, people trying to wrap their heads around what was going on.
It was chaotic, much less so for us.
Was it quite serene for you, I imagine?
In a way it was, because, very few of us traveled with cell phones back then. Certainly crew members did not take them on internet. That's because the cost was so expensive to call. And so only a few passengers in first class had cell phones and no way to charge them. So they were all losing their battery life. And, the planes on the phone were shut down, so they didn't work. So we really had very little information. We were not seeing the visuals on TV that the rest of the world was seeing. We were insulated from that. And it wasn't until about 30 hours after the attacks, when we got to our motel room, we stayed at the Comfort Inn as far as the crew. My passengers were at the Knights of Columbus Lodge. And it wasn't until we saw the images that we could even begin to comprehend what had happened. I mean, it was just unimaginable.
And sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
What I was going to say was having also unimaginable for anybody watching, really, but unimaginable especially for you, given the fact that not only are you an airline pilot, but also you were an airline pilot in the air and being directly affected by this thing at that moment.
Right. It was just, you could not imagine that your fellow crew members had their throats slit with box cutters. It was unthinkable. I mean, we didn't have a checklist for that. We didn't have a routine. We didn't have a plan. It wasn't something we had ever rehearsed or practiced or trained for. It just wasn't. I can tell you that things are very different today. I'm not sure it would ever happen on an airplane today, because I think the passengers would be so vigilant of anything abnormal. not to mention that our procedures have changed immensely, and our cockpit doors are different, and we have a lot of things that are not like they were on that day. But I lost a friend. I had a friend of mine who was the captain on our airplane that went into the Pentagon. And when I finally was able to talk to my husband very late in the afternoon on 9/11, and he's reading the crew list to me, and I couldn't believe it. I'd just seen that captain in London like the week before. It's just something you as an airline pilot cannot comprehend, that it happened on an airliner. You couldn't imagine it.
And you used that phrase earlier on, Beverley, of feeling survivor's guilt.
We did a little bit because we were being treated so well by the folks in Gander. I mean, some people had been to Paris on vacation, and they said they ate better in Gander than they did in Paris. They were fed 3 meals a day, every day for 5 days, and a total of 285,000 meals were served to the passengers and the crew and the volunteers during that time. Over 2,000 prescriptions were filled, and nobody was charged a dime for anything. I mean, they wouldn't let you pay for anything. They took people moose hunting. They had barbecue cookouts. They took the kids on hay rides and canoe rides. And, it was like being entertained for 4 or 5 days. And our country was going through such a horrific time. And there were some passengers that when we finally did leave, they didn't want to leave. They did not want to leave Gander.
Yeah, I can imagine. Not least not going back into America. Your relationship with those people in Gander must have been pretty strong after those 6 days. We consider them family. We've been back about 6 times. It's like a family reunion. And now, as a result of the musical Come From Away being written, the producers are so wonderful because we've got 5 casts in 4 countries playing on 3 continents 8 times a week. And every time we've had a major opening, like on Broadway in Toronto and London and Melbourne and the U.S. tour, that producers fly the folks from Gander in, and we are called Come From Aways. If you are not born in Newfoundland, they call you a Come From Away. You have come from somewhere else. So that's what they called us. We were the Come From Aways. And, we all get together, and it truly is like a family reunion. And as you said, there was a musical made of this called Come From Away. I want to talk about that in a minute. Firstly, we say that 9/11 changed the world, Beverley. Did it change your world and your relationship with aviation and with flying?
I would say that probably the folks in aviation were affected more than any other business in the world because, oh boy, not only did we lose crew members who were friends of ours, everything about our airlines changed. Every airline in America filed bankruptcy. American Airlines was the last one of the majors to file bankruptcy. And in the airline world, in actually the aviation world, we as pilots have what we refer to as the lost decade. It took 10 years after 9/11 for the airlines to actually thrive again. And I can tell you American Airlines went 10 years without hiring a single pilot. And I actually read a statistic today that I had never known. In 2001, the airlines lost $22.1 billion. That was the impact of 9/11.
Wow. And
it takes a long time to recover from that.
Quite. Your relationship with flying goes back to day one. It's in your blood, isn't it? Did it change your relationship with aviation and with flying?
No. I was never going to let the evilness of this ruin what I had loved my entire life. And when we got back to Dallas, I called American every single day, and I said, I'm ready to fly, or wherever. I'm ready to go. And they said, no, we think you should take a few days off. But no, I was back in the air, and I flew 7 years after 9/11 before I retired from American. And the only reason I retired early was, again, because the threat of bankruptcy, and our retirement plan was tied to the viability of the airline. So a lot of us went earlier than we would have had 9/11 not occurred.
Wow.
But it had a terrible impact on the airline industry.
How did it feel that first time that you stepped into a cockpit after 9/11?
You know, the cockpit was perfectly fine. Nothing had changed about the cockpit. But what did change is, I think, the pilots and certainly the flight attendants took on such an awareness of each and every passenger. I mean, they were taught to look at people, look at them in the eye if you saw anything that was suspicious or out of the ordinary. And, you know, prior to 9/11, people just boarded the plane like they do every day. And you didn't pay that much attention to each individual passenger. After 9/11, that changed quite a bit. Really? It really did. Yes, and more so for the flight attendants because of their, close exposure to the passengers.
Sure. I was doing some research into you earlier, Beverley, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I one of the things that really surprised me and took me aback a little bit was your first flying job when you were a young woman, which was really bizarre, wasn't it? Can you just explain what that was?
Oh, yes. Yes. My first flying job was flying bodies for a mortician. The mortician actually kept his airplane at our flight school. And one day he needed a 19-year-old girl who had died from an overdose delivered to her family in Arkansas. And I was in Fort Worth, Texas. And all the guys were out flying other trips, and I was the only one around. And I said, I'll do it. I volunteered, and I ended up flying for him for 2 years after that. So I transported a lot of bodies. I went to college in the daytime and flew the bodies in the afternoons and evening. And I got paid $5 an hour. The airplane was so small, the two back seats were removed, and the right front seat was folded down, and the body was only on a stretcher with a sheet over it. It was not in a casket because the cargo door was not big enough to get a casket in. So yeah, I had to step over their face to get to my seat to fly the airplane.
Wow. What about formaldehyde? Was that used?
Yes, very much so, and it does burn your eyes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
All the bodies that I transported had been embalmed, and if they'd been burned or something, the formaldehyde was very hard to fly with. Because your eyes would water the whole time.
God, blimey. What a baptism that is. Your first flying job. And so this took you on to being the third female pilot and then the first captain for American Airlines.
Right.
That seems like particularly given the age and the era, such a big leap and such a big jump and a piece of glass ceiling breaking.
Right. I did have a lot of flying jobs before I actually got hired by American. It took about 6 years to actually, build up my flight hours and get the experience where they would even consider interviewing me. I was 24 years old when I got called for the interview, and I was American's third pilot, as I mentioned. And then 10 years later, I was American's first female captain. And so I had quite an amazing career. I flew for 32 years. My goal was to be a captain on the biggest jet in the system, and I flew that jet for 9 years before I retired.
Did you experience any misogyny getting into that job?
No, I must say they were very good to me. I was treated with ultimate respect. American, and not every airline was like this, but American was actually quite proud of its female pilots. They were very good to us. They let us help design our uniform. We did not wear a man's tie. We did not wear a man's hat. We had our own female pilot uniform. And many of the other airlines were not like that. They wouldn't let the girls wear makeup or fingernail polish, and they had to dress like a man. American treated us very different, and I was always very proud of that fact. And I appreciated it greatly because, I always said, I'm a girl first. I just happen to be a girl pilot. I wear makeup. I wear fingernail polish. But the guys were wonderful to me. They really were. And I always say, you just have to be great at your job and you have to maintain respect. And if you have that in a man's world, they generally just treat you great. Not always, I guess, but for me it was great.
Beverley, what do you do today on the anniversary of September 11th?
You know, it's always amazing to me that so many years have gone by. Being involved with the musical, which we really haven't addressed yet.
Let me just mention that then. So this is the musical Come From Away that is based on the story of you arriving in Canada and the incredible reception that you got.
It is. It's not just about me, but I am a person that is portrayed in the show. There are actually 12 actors, and they play about 78 different people. And, you know, I went back to Gander on the 10th anniversary. And unlike America, where we memorialize 9/11, they actually commemorate 9/11. For them, it is a lot of celebrations about how wonderful they were to all of us on that day. And so we went back to Gander, and that is when I actually met the playwrights, David Hine and Irene Sankoff, and they had been given a Canadian grant to go to Gander for a month to see if there was a story. And they left, they will tell you, with 16,000 stories, and they spent the next 4 years writing the musical. They wrote the music, the lyrics, the play, and the book. And 4 years later, I got a call from the producers inviting me to the world premiere opening of Come From Away in La Jolla, California. I didn't even know the play had been written.
Wow.
And we have been on a journey with it since the summer of 2015, and it has just escalated because the show is not only in the U.S. or Broadway, I mean, it's all over the world. It has become a worldwide phenomenon.
Brilliant.
And when I left Gander on September 15th, I remember telling my crew, I just want the whole world to hear the story about Gander and how wonderful they were to all of us. And that's what Come From Away is doing today. So it's wonderful.
Beverley, it has been such a privilege to talk to you this morning. And I cannot thank you enough for sharing what must be a really, really difficult subject for you to relive.
It is. You know, I'm very sad for my fellow crew members and certainly all of the people who lost their lives. It is a very sad day, but I think the most important thing is that we never forget, and I always try to do something very nice to pay it forward and just show my appreciation for everything that we've been able to enjoy since that time.
Beverley, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I hope today's okay for you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the talk.